Virgin Mountain Man lived alone for years, until 10 giant Amish women asked for shelter. For decades, he survived in silence, cutting wood, whispering prayers, never knowing a soul's touch. But one freezing night, the knock at his cabin door shattered everything. 10 towering Amish women, desperate, frost clinging to their dresses, begged him for shelter, and he let them in. At first, it seemed like a miracle warmth. Laughter, hymns rising where once there was only silence. But on the frontier, miracles never come free. Soon, riders thundered through the snow with papers and pistols, claiming the women as property. Fires sparked in the night, and enemies circled, whispering that the mountain man would burn for defying them. What secret ties these women to a powerful speculator back east? What hidden strength must the loneliest man on the mountain find to protect them? The storm is closing in, and one choice will decide everything: stand alone or build a family worth dying for. Will the Virgin Mountain Man keep his vow to shelter the more, lose everything to the fire of greed and betrayal? Before we dive in, drop your name or city in the comments. It reminds me that behind every view is a real heartbeat. The winter wind howled through the Colorado Rockies as Matthew Yoder's axe bit deep into another log. His massive frame cast long shadows in the fading daylight, each swing precise and practiced. Snowflakes began to fall faster now, coating his broad shoulders and dark beard with white specks that melted from his warmth. "Best get inside," he muttered to himself, gathering the split wood in his arms. The weather was turning meaner by the minute, and he'd learned long ago to heed such warnings in these mountains. Inside his snug cabin, Matthew carefully arranged the fresh-cut logs beside the stone fireplace. The single room felt vast and empty, as it had for all these years since he'd lost his family to fever. A coal oil lamp cast dancing shadows on rough-hewn walls adorned only with simple hooks. Holding his few possessions, a winter coat, a hunting rifle, and a worn Bible. Moving to his small iron stove, Matthew stirred the pot of rabbit stew he'd prepared. The aroma of carrots and wild onions filled the space, but somehow made the silence deeper. He ladled some into a tin bowl, settled onto his wooden chair, and bowed his head. "Lord," he prayed softly, "thank you for this food and shelter from the storm." His quiet words seemed to disappear into the emptiness around him. The sudden pounding on his door nearly made him drop his bowl. Matthew's head snapped up, his heart racing. In all his years up here, he'd rarely had visitors, especially not after nightfall in a snowstorm. Grabbing his rifle, he approached the door cautiously. The pounding came again, more desperate this time, accompanied by muffled voices that sounded strangely feminine. Matthew cracked open the door, rifle ready, and blinked in astonishment. 10 tall women stood huddled together on his porch, their plain dark dresses and white caps marking them as Amish. They were soaked through from the snow, shivering violently in the bitter wind. "Please," the one in front spoke, her teeth chattering. "Our wagon broke down a mile back. We've nowhere else to go." Matthew stood frozen, overwhelmed by the sudden appearance of so many people, women no less, at his isolated cabin. His natural shyness made him want to retreat, but their desperate situation was clear. "We fled Pennsylvania," another woman added, hugging herself against the cold. "The bishop seized our family farm. We were heading west, but the wheel shattered on some rocks." Matthew's grip tightened on his rifle as he wrestled with his decision. These women clearly needed help. They'd freeze to death in this weather. But he hadn't shared his space with anyone in years, let alone 10 strange women, looking at their frightened yet hopeful faces. He felt something shift in his heart. Slowly, he lowered his rifle and stepped back from the doorway. "Come in," he said gruffly, "before you catch your death." The women hurried inside, bringing with them a swirl of snowflakes and the rustle of wet skirts. Matthew quickly added more logs to the fire, building it higher as the women gathered close to the warmth, rubbing their frozen hands. "There's stew," he offered awkwardly, gesturing to the pot. "Not much, but it's hot." The women's faces lit up with grateful smiles. Matthew found bowls and spoons, serving them each a portion of his simple meal. Soon the cabin was filled with the sounds of quiet eating and murmured thanks. As they warmed up, the women began to softly sing what Matthew recognized as an old German hymn. Their voices blended in perfect harmony, filling every corner of his cabin with music. He stood in the shadows, watching in wonder as his lonely home transformed. The firelight played across their faces as they sang, their voices rising and falling like a gentle tide. Some of the younger ones leaned against their older sisters, or cousins. Exhausted from their journey, but safe now from the storm, Matthew felt something stir in his chest, an ache he'd almost forgotten. How long had it been since his cabin held anything but silence? How many years had passed without the sound of human voices raised in song? As the hymn ended, he looked around at these unexpected guests who had appeared like angels in the snow. His solitary life had been appended in the space of an hour, and yet there was something right about it all, something that felt like the answer to prayers he hadn't even known he was praying. "Lord," he whispered under his breath, "what have you sent me?" Outside, the wind continued to howl and the snow fell thick and fast. But inside Matthew's cabin, for the first time in years, there was warmth, fellowship, and song. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the snow-laden clouds in shades of steel gray. The storm showed no signs of letting up, its fierce winds rattling the cabin's windows. Inside, Matthew stirred from his makeshift bed near the fireplace, where he had insisted the women take his narrow cot and quilts. The sight that greeted him made him blink twice. His usually sparse cabin had transformed overnight. The women were already awake, moving with quiet efficiency as they tidied his humble space. Their wet dresses hung from a line they'd strung across the room, dripping slowly onto carefully placed buckets. The tallest woman, her expression serene despite their circumstances, approached him with a gentle smile. "I am Sarah Miller," she said, her voice warm and steady. "These are my sisters and cousins." She gestured to the others, who paused their work to nod in greeting. "We are most grateful for your kindness, Matthew Yoder." Matthew shuffled his feet, uncertain how to handle such feminine presence in his solitary domain. "Ain't much," he mumbled, watching as two of the younger women kneaded dough on his rough-hewn table, making the most of his meager stores of flour. "We will make do," Sarah assured him, her calm authority somehow both commanding and comforting. "The Lord provides, even in the wilderness." Throughout the day, Matthew found himself both unsettled and oddly soothed by their presence. His tiny cabin, usually so empty, now hummed with quiet activity. The women moved around him like tall, graceful shadows, their simple, dark dresses brushing past as they worked. They seemed to find purpose in every corner, setting things right with capable hands that spoke of years of honest labor. As evening approached, Sarah gathered everyone near the fireplace. "Shall we sing?" she suggested, and the others nodded eagerly. Matthew stood awkwardly by his chair, unsure whether to join them or retreat to the shadows. Their voices rose in perfect harmony, filling the cabin with the familiar words of Rock of Ages. Matthew felt his throat tighten as memories of his mother singing the same hymn washed over him. The women's strong, clear voices seemed to reach into every dark corner of his lonely existence, making his eyes burn with unexpected tears. The peaceful moment shattered at the sound of heavy fists pounding on his door. Matthew's hand instinctively moved toward his rifle, but Sarah's gentle touch stopped him. "Let us pray," she whispered, "while you see who comes on such a night." Matthew opened the door to find two men on his porch, their badges marking them. As deputies from the valley, snow caked their heavy coats, and their hands rested too casually near their holstered pistols. The taller one thrust a sheaf of papers toward Matthew's chest. "These women are the legal wards of Mr. James Harrison," the deputy announced, his voice hard with authority. "He's a business associate of their bishop back east. Got papers here proving his guardianship." The second deputy stepped forward, his expression stern. "You'll be charged with harboring fugitives if you don't turn them over. Mountain man, that's serious trouble you don't need." Behind Matthew, he could hear the women's prayers, their voices barely above a whisper. His hands trembled slightly on the doorframe, but his voice remained steady. "These women ain't property," he said quietly. Then, gathering his courage, he firmly shut the door in the deputies' faces. Through the thick wood, he heard cursing and threats, but the men eventually withdrew into the howling storm. Matthew leaned his forehead against the rough-hewn door, his heart pounding. What had he done? A lifetime of avoiding trouble, of keeping to himself, and now he had defied the law itself. He turned to find the women still kneeling in prayer, their faces peaceful despite the danger. Sarah looked up at him with eyes full of understanding and gratitude. The sight stirred something. Deep in his chest, a certainty that transcended his fears. Matthew sank into his chair, doubt and worry churning inside him. The deputies would return, probably with more men. He had no right to risk everything for these strangers. Yet as he watched the women rise from their prayers, straightening their caps and sharing knowing looks of courage, he knew he could never turn them away. Something stronger than fear had taken root in his heart, a sense of purpose he had never known in all his years of solitude. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, a different kind of strength was building. Matthew might not understand all that God had in mind, bringing these strong, faithful women to his door. But he knew with growing certainty that he would protect them. Whatever the cost, the next morning brought a gentle reprieve from the storm. The heavy snowfall had eased 2 lazy flakes drifting down from pearl-gray skies. Matthew stood beside the women's broken wagon, which they had managed to drag near his cabin the night before. The splintered axle told a clear story of their desperate journey. "Reckon we can fix this," Matthew said, running his calloused hand along the broken wood. "Got some good mountain pine that'll serve." He glanced at the towering women gathered around him, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Sarah nodded, her practical nature showing through. "Show us how, Matthew. We're not afraid of work." Matthew led them to his woodpile, explaining how to select the straightest grain for strength. The women listened intently, their capable hands already reaching for tools. To his surprise, they moved with the sure confidence of those long used to hard labor. "See here," he demonstrated, marking the pine log with careful measurements. "Gotta shape it just so, or it won't hold true." As they worked together through the morning, Matthew found himself repeatedly amazed. While he taught them about working with the mountain timber, they showed their own expertise. 2 of the younger women skillfully repaired worn leather harnesses, their fingers flying over the complicated stitching. Others took inventory of their meager supplies. Somehow, managing to conjure up enough ingredients for cornbread, the quiet industry reminded Matthew of busy bees in a hive, each person contributing their part. The scent of baking bread soon wafted. From his cabin, mixing with the sharp smell of fresh-cut pine, "The Lord gives different gifts to each of us," Sarah remarked, watching Matthew shape the new axle with sure strokes of his draw knife. She stood nearby, holding the timber steady. "Your skills with wood, that's a blessing meant to help others." Matthew paused in his work, considering her words. "Ain't thought of it that way before," he admitted. "Always just did what needed doing." "Sometimes that's how God works," Sarah said softly. Through simple things, done with care, she brushed snow from her dark dress. "Our faith is strong enough for this trial, Matthew, and now we face it together." By late afternoon, the wagon stood repaired, the new axle solid and true. The group gathered inside the cabin, where the women had prepared a simple but filling supper. Matthew found himself seated at his own table, surrounded by quiet conversation and occasional laughter. "Brother Matthew," one of the younger women teased gently, "you cut wood straight as any man in Lancaster County." The others smiled, and Matthew felt his cheeks warm at the familiar way they'd begun, including him in their circle for the first time in years. Something long dormant stirred in Matthew's chest, a sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than his solitary existence. The feeling both comforted and unsettled him. Like a forgotten song suddenly remembered, the peaceful moment shattered with the thunder of hoofbeats outside. Before anyone could move, something crashed through the window, sending glass shards scattering across the plank floor. Several of the women cried out in alarm. Matthew jumped to his feet, but the rider was already galloping away into the gathering dusk. On the floor lay a rock with a piece of paper tied around it. With trembling fingers, Sarah untied the note and read it aloud. "Surrender the women by week's end, or watch your cabin burn to the ground." The women huddled closer together, their earlier joy replaced by fear. Matthew saw their shoulders trembling, heard their whispered prayers, but for once, he didn't feel his usual urge to shrink from confrontation. Instead, he stood straighter, his massive frame casting a protective shadow in the lamplight. "This is your home now," he declared, his quiet voice carrying the weight of certainty. "I'll see no harm come to you." Sarah reached out and squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you, Matthew. but we cannot ask you to risk everything for us." "Ain't asking," Matthew replied simply. "It's already decided." They finished their meal in subdued quiet, the broken window now covered with a spare quilt. Yet despite the threat hanging over them, a new strength had taken root in the cabin. Matthew felt it in the way the women moved closer together, in their determined expressions, in his own surprising resolve, as he helped clear away the supper dishes. Matthew caught sight of his reflection in the window's remaining glass. The face, looking back at him, seemed different somehow, less uncertain, more purposeful. The change startled him, but it felt right. Like a piece of himself he hadn't known was missing had finally fallen into place. The days flowed together like a gentle stream, each one bringing small changes to Matthew's once solitary life. His cabin, which had known only silence for so many years, now awakened each morning to the sound of women's voices. Their laughter rang clear as bell chimes while they kindled the fire. Before dawn's first light touched the mountain peaks, Matthew would wake to the rhythmic sound of the butter churn and the scent of fresh coffee. Where once he'd eaten alone, now he joined the sisters and cousins at his expanded table, their tall frames making the cabin seem fuller, warmer somehow. "You must learn this one, Matthew," Sarah would say, in the evenings, leading the group in another hymn. Matthew, who hadn't sung since childhood, found himself stumbling over the German words, his deep voice gradually growing stronger with practice. In return, he taught them the ways of the mountain. See here, he'd demonstrate, showing them how to set snares for rabbits. Gotta think like the creature you're hunting. The women proved to be quick learners, their capable hands soon matching his skill at checking traps and cleaning game at the woodpile. Matthew showed them the proper way to split logs. "Mind the grain," he'd explain, positioning the axe just so. "Let the wood tell you where it wants to part." The women took turns practicing their strong arms, swinging the axe with growing confidence. Day by day, his rough cabin transformed. Women hung colorful quilts on the walls, their intricate patterns bringing warmth to the bare logs. Working together, they built sturdy benches from pine logs Matthew had cut, smoothing them with careful hands until they shone. Shelves appeared along the walls, soon lined with jars of preserved wild berries the women had gathered and prepared. When Sunday arrived, Matthew surprised himself by making the offer. "There's a church down in town," he said hesitantly over breakfast. "Reckon I could show you the way if you've a mind to go." The women's faces brightened at his words. "We would be grateful," Sarah replied, speaking for them all. The small group made quite a sight as they walked into the white paint church that morning. Matthew led the way, the 10 tall women following in their plain dark dresses. Heads turned and whispers rustled through the congregation like wind through dry leaves. The minister, a kindly man with gray at his temples, stepped forward to greet them. "Welcome, welcome," he said warmly, though Matthew noticed several prominent townspeople frowning from their pews. "We're blessed to have you join us today." During the service, when time came for hymns, the women rose as one. Their voices lifted in perfect harmony, filling the small church with sound. Matthew watched in wonder as their song soared to the rafters, strong and pure. The entire congregation fell silent, caught in the beauty of the moment. For the first time in his life, Matthew stood tall among his neighbors, no longer trying to make himself smaller or fade into shadows. Pride straightened his spine as he joined in the singing, adding his voice to the chorus. But after the final amen, as people filed out of the church, Josiah Burton, one of the town's leading merchants, cornered Matthew by the steps. His face was stern beneath his black hat brim. "You're making a mistake, Yoder," Burton said in a low voice, gripping Matthew's arm. "Siding with outsiders won't end well for you. Best remember who your real neighbors are. Real neighbors are." Matthew felt the familiar urge to duck his head, to agree just to keep peace. Instead, he met Burton's gaze steadily. "They're good folks," he said quietly, God-fearing and honest. Burton's grip tightened. "They're trouble, and you know it. Mark my words." That evening, back in his cabin, Matthew felt the weight of Burton's warning settle heavy on his shoulders. The women sang softly as they prepared supper, their harmonies weaving through the lamplight. But his thoughts kept returning to the merchant's threats. He watched Sarah teaching one of her younger cousins to knead bread dough, saw the way they moved around his home as if they'd always belonged there. The sight warmed him, yet fear crept in like a cold draft through wall cracks. What would standing by these women cost him in the end? Through the window, Matthew could see the town's church spire catching the last rays of sunset. The same folk who'd sat spellbound by the women's singing would now be gathering in the Mercantile, sharing Burton's dark opinions. Public opinion could turn as quick and dangerous as mountain weather, and Matthew knew well how harsh such storms could be. The snow returned with fierce determination, blanketing Matthew's mountain homestead in deep white drifts. Thick flakes swirled past the cabin windows, sealing them all inside together. The enforced closeness might have made Matthew uncomfortable just days ago, but now he found comfort in the steady rhythms of shared life. Inside the cabin, warmth and industry flourished. The women had set up their quilting frame near the brightest window, their nimble fingers creating intricate patterns from fabric scraps. The soft whisper of thread through cloth mixed with the gentle murmur of their voices. Matthew sat near the hearth, whittling chunks of pine into useful items, spoons, bowls, and pegs for hanging clothes. His large hands, usually more suited to axe work, learned to move with surprising delicacy over the wood grain. "You have a gift for carving," Sarah observed, pausing in her quilting to watch him work. "The Lord gives each of us talents, if we but listen for them." As evening approached, they gathered around the table for a simple supper of bean soup and cornbread. The familiar comfort of shared food seemed to open something in the women's hearts. Sarah cleared her throat, her usually steady voice wavering slightly. "Perhaps it's time we told you the whole truth of why we fled," she said, meeting Matthew's eyes across the table. The other women grew still, their spoons paused mid-motion. Sarah's tale spilled out like water from a broken dam. Their bishop, back in Pennsylvania, had made an unholy alliance with a land speculator named Harrison Drake. Together, they had schemed to seize the women's family farm land that had been in their family for 3 generations. "The bishop said we were unnatural," one of the younger women added, her voice bitter. "Said women weren't meant to be tall and strong like us. Called it an affront to God's plan. He claimed no proper man would wed us," Sarah continued, her hands clenched tight in her lap. "Said, our size and strength made us unfit for marriage. When Drake offered to buy our land for a fraction of its worth, the bishop declared us unfit to manage it ourselves." Matthew's eyes filled with tears as he listened. His own massive frame had always made him feel like an outsider, something to be feared or mocked. He understood the pain of being judged for God's own handiwork. "When we refused to submit," Sarah said, "they tried to force us, but we chose to flee instead. We would rather face uncertainty in the West than bow to such injustice." Matthew's voice was rough with emotion when he finally spoke. "Since I was just a boy, I've lived alone up here," he confessed. "After the fever took my family, I couldn't bear the way folks looked at me like I was something to fear. Reckoned it was easier to keep to myself than face more rejection." The women's faces softened with understanding. Sarah reached across the table to clasp his large hand in her own equally substantial one. "God often sets apart the strong for a greater purpose," she said gently. "Perhaps he brought us together for just such a reason." Later that night, Matthew stepped out to gather more firewood from the stack against the cabin wall. The snow had finally ceased, leaving the world hushed and white under a cold moon. As he bent to gather the logs, movement caught his eye. There, at the edge of the trees, dark figures stood watching. His heart clenched. Drake's men, no doubt, sent to spy. On them, Matthew forced himself to move naturally, gathering the wood as if he'd seen nothing. Inside, he added logs to the fire, saying nothing of what he'd witnessed. The women were finding peace here. He wouldn't disturb their evening with fresh fears, but Sarah's sharp eyes missed little. The next morning, as Matthew sat cleaning his rifle, she settled beside him. "Something troubles you," she said quietly. "I saw it in your face at breakfast." Matthew hesitated, then admitted the truth. "Drake's men were watching the cabin last night. The danger is closer than we thought." Sarah's face grew serious, but not afraid. She took his hand, her grip strong and sure. "Then we shall face it together," she declared, "with prayer and faith as our shield." Matthew looked down at their joined hands, his scarred and rough from years of solitude, hers strong and capable from honest work. Together, he agreed, and for the first time in years, he felt truly ready to stand his ground. They bowed their heads, their prayer rising soft but determined in the morning light. Outside, fresh snow began to fall, but within the cabin, courage and resolve burned bright as the hearth fire. The morning dawned crisp and bright, the storm finally releasing its grip on the mountain. Matthew stood on his porch, watching the sun glint off snowdrifts that reached halfway up his fence posts. After days of being snowbound, they needed supplies, and badly. The sled should make it down to town now, he announced at breakfast. Two of the younger women, Ruth and Mary, volunteered to accompany him. They wrapped themselves in warm shawls. While Matthew hitched up his strongest horse to the heavy wooden sled, the trip down the mountain took longer than usual, the horse picking its way carefully through deep snow. Matthew sat rigid on the sled seat, already tensing for the town's reaction. Ruth and Mary sat behind him, their voices lifting in quiet hymns that seemed to make the journey lighter. As they approached the town's main street, heads turned and whispers started. Matthew could feel eyes following their progress, could hear the murmurs rising like wind through dry grass. Outside the blacksmith's shop, 3 men stopped their work entirely to stare. "There goes the Virgin Mountain Man," one called out loud, enough to be heard, with 2 of his 10 wives. Matthew's face burned red as fire. His hands tightened on the reins until his knuckles showed white. But before he could respond, Ruth stood up in the sled, her tall frame straight as a pine tree. "We are a family of faith," she declared clearly, her voice carrying across the street. "Not a subject for scandal. Your words do you no credit, sir." The men looked away, abashed by her quiet dignity. Matthew felt pride replace his shame as they continued on to the mercantile. Inside the store, the shopkeeper's wife watched them with narrow eyes as Matthew purchased what they needed: 3 sacks of flour, packets of seed for spring planting, and a box of nails for repairs. "Planning on building something?" she asked, her tone suggesting more gossip than genuine interest. "Yes, ma'am," Matthew answered simply. "A proper home for a proper family." They loaded their purchases onto the sled, working together with the efficient rhythm they'd developed over their days together. As they passed the judge's office, Matthew noticed Judge Harlan Whitfield standing on his porch. The circuit judge was known for his fairness, even in difficult cases. He nodded politely to their group, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Good day to you, Mr. Yoder," he called out. "Ladies." There was something in his tone, a hint of support, perhaps even alliance, that made Matthew's shoulders straighten. They might need a friend with legal authority. Before this was over, the sun was setting by the time they made it back up the mountain. Golden lights spilled from the cabin windows, and wonderful smells wafted out to greet them. Inside, they found the other women had been busy. New shelves lined one wall, their rough-hewn boards already holding jars and tools in neat rows. A dozen loaves of bread sat rising by the fire, covered with clean cloths. "You've been mighty industrious," Matthew said, smiling at how they'd transformed his humble cabin yet again. Sarah helped him unload the supplies while Ruth and Mary told the others about their trip to town. They had just sat down to their evening meal when the attack came. The sound of shattering glass filled the cabin as rocks crashed through multiple windows. Cold air rushed in through the broken panes. Matthew grabbed his rifle and rushed outside, scanning the darkness for movement. But all he found were hoofprints in the snow, already starting to fill with fresh powder. The speculator's men had struck fast and fled faster. Anger burned in his chest as he returned inside, expecting to find the women huddled in fear. Instead, he stopped in the doorway, amazed. They had already hung quilts over the broken windows to keep out the wind. More importantly, they were singing, their voices rising strong and clear in one of their favorite hymns. Sarah met his eyes as she sang, her face serene despite the violence they'd just endured. "Rock of Ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee." Matthew felt something powerful move through him as he listened. These women would not be broken by fear or intimidation. Their faith stood stronger than stone, their courage deeper than any mountain root. The speculator's men could break every window in his cabin, but they couldn't shatter the spirit within. These walls he joined in the hymn, his deep voice blending with theirs as they worked to clean up the broken glass. Together, they turned an act of hatred into an evening of praise. Matthew knew then that no amount of gossip or threats could make him regret opening his door that snowy night. These women had brought more than industry and song to his lonely cabin. They'd brought the kind of strength that could only come from unshakable faith. The days began to settle into comfortable patterns as another week passed on the mountain. Each morning, Matthew woke to the soft murmur of prayers and the gentle clatter of pots as the women moved about his cabin. It's their cabin now. The thought warmed him, even as winter's chill pressed against the patched windows in the pale dawn light. 3 of the women would bundle up to tend the small winter garden they had cleverly built against the south-facing wall, using old windows. To create a makeshift greenhouse, others mended tools with skilled hands, singing as they worked. The sound of their industry filled spaces that had been silent for so long. "You hold it firm like this," Matthew demonstrated one morning, showing them how to brace a rifle against their shoulders. Though the women were strong from years of farm work, they handled the weapons with obvious reluctance. "We trust in the Lord's protection," Sarah said gently, though she paid careful attention to his instructions. "But we understand these troubled times call for wisdom as well as faith." Matthew nodded, respecting their peaceful ways while knowing the rifle might yet be needed. He watched as each woman practiced, their tall frames adapting naturally to the stance he showed them. The women, in turn, began teaching Matthew their simple Amish prayers. Each morning, they would gather around the table, heads bowed, and speak the ancient words that had guided their people through centuries of hardship. At first, Matthew only listened, shy about stumbling over the unfamiliar phrases. But gradually, he began to whisper along, finding comfort in the ritual. As evening fell each day, they would gather near the fireplace. 10 strong voices would lift in harmony, filling the cabin with hymns that drifted out across the snow-covered valley. The songs spoke of faith, of deliverance, of God's endless love, things Matthew had almost forgotten in his years of solitude. Night, as the last notes of Amazing Grace faded, Matthew felt something break open inside him. Without planning to, he began to pray aloud. "Lord," his voice trembled but grew stronger, "for so long I felt you had abandoned me. After losing my family, I turned away, thinking myself alone. But now I see you were leading me here all along, preparing this place, this moment." Tears rolled freely down his weathered cheeks. "You've brought me a family when I least expected it, shown me love when I thought there was none left." The women's eyes shone with joyful tears as they gathered around him, their hands gentle on his shoulders. Sarah's voice rose in a prayer of thanksgiving, and soon they were all praising God together, their voices mixing with happy laughter. But their celebration was cut brutally short. "Smoke!" one of the younger women cried out suddenly. Dark tendrils were curling under the cabin door, bringing with them the acrid smell of burning wood. Matthew burst through the door, the women right behind him. Flames were already crawling. Up the corner of the porch, the woodpile beside it crackling with orange fire. In the darkness beyond, he caught a glimpse of riders disappearing into the trees, the speculators' men, striking with fire when threats had failed. "Form a line," Sarah commanded her, voice cutting through the panic. "From the well to the porch." The women moved with practiced efficiency, passing buckets of water from hand to hand. Matthew and to others scooped up clean snow, packing it. Against the burning wood, steam hissed and smoke billowed as they fought the flames. For long minutes, they worked in desperate silence, broken only by the crack of burning wood and their labored breathing in the cold night air. Finally, the last flame sputtered out, leaving them standing in darkness, their clothes soaked and freezing. The porch was scorched, but standing. The woodpile had suffered worse, with nearly half their winter supply destroyed. But the cabin itself, thanks to their quick action, had survived. They gathered inside, shivering as they hung wet clothes by the fire. The attack had shaken them all, but there was no talk of leaving, no suggestion of surrender. Sarah crossed to where Matthew stood, staring out the damaged door. She took his large, rough hands in hers, her grip firm and warm despite everything. "We'll not run," she declared, her voice carrying to all corners of the cabin. "This is our home now." The others nodded firmly, determination written on every face. Matthew looked around at these strong, faithful women who had burst into his life like a miracle, and felt his own resolve harden. Whatever came next, they would face it together, with faith and courage as their shields. The morning after the fire, Matthew gathered everyone around the scarred kitchen table. His expression was grave as he spread out a rough map drawn on brown paper. "We need a safe place," he explained, pointing to a gentle slope about a quarter-mile from the cabin. "Something hidden where we can shelter, if they come back with worse than fire." Sarah nodded, understanding immediately. "A dugout," she said. Like our people built when first settling in Pennsylvania, they began work that very day. Matthew showed them how to choose the right spot, a south-facing hillside where snow would melt first in spring. The women's efficiency amazed him as they organized themselves into teams, some clearing brush, while others began marking the dimensions with stakes and twine. "Keep the entrance narrow," Matthew instructed, demonstrating how to dig into the hillside makes it easier to defend. The women worked with incredible strength, their tall frames well suited to the heavy labor. Matthew watched in awe as 3 of them lifted a massive pine beam that he would have struggled with alone. They sang as they worked, their voices rising above the rhythmic thud of shovels and axes. "Blessed be the tie that binds." They sang the old hymn, keeping time with their labor. The sound echoed off the hillside, making the whole mountain feel alive with praise. As days passed, the dugout took shape. They lined the walls with split logs, chinked with moss and clay to keep out the wind. The ceiling they built, extra sturdy, supporting it with thick beams that the women handled as easily as kindling. Matthew had never seen such strength in women before, yet they wielded it with such grace. Their movements sure and practiced from years of farm work. The evenings grew longer as winter deepened, but they were far from lonely now. After supper, they would gather around the cabin's fireplace, sharing stories as they worked on small projects. Matthew found himself opening up about his years in the mountains, tales of grizzly bears and summer storms that made the women laugh and gasp. In all the right places. "Tell us about the time you found that lost cavalry horse." Sarah would encourage, her eyes twinkling as she worked on mending. The women shared their own stories, 2 memories of massive barn raisings back east, where hundreds of Amish would gather to raise a structure in a single day. They spoke of massive feasts afterward, of courtships begun across tables laden with pie and roasted chicken. Their voices grew soft with nostalgia, but never bitter, despite all they had left behind. One evening, while they were all working to repair a broken plow before the ground froze solid, Matthew's hand slipped on the cold metal. The blade bit deep into his palm, blood welling up immediately. "Here," Sarah said, taking his hand in hers before he could pull away. Her touch was gentle but sure as she examined the wound. "Rebecca, bring my medicine bag." Matthew sat still, oddly aware of how small his huge hand looked in Sarah's equally large ones. She cleaned the cut carefully with whiskey that stung like fire, then bound it skillfully with clean linen strips. "You've got healing hands," Matthew said softly, surprised by how much he had come to trust her steady presence. Sarah smiled but kept working, her fingers deft as she tied off the bandage. The days grew shorter and colder as they finished the dugout. They stocked it carefully with dried food, blankets, and other essentials, anything they might need if forced to flee the cabin. But their own supplies were beginning to run low. The destroyed woodpile had been only the start of their troubles. Now their food stores were dwindling faster than expected. With so many mouths to feed, Matthew studied their remaining provisions with growing concern. They had maybe 2 weeks of food left, 3 if they stretched it carefully. The winter showed no signs of loosening its grip on the mountain. "We have 2 choices," he told them one evening. "Either we try to make what we have last, knowing it likely won't, or I go hunting." He paused, looking troubled. "But the only game left this time of year is up in Ute territory. It would be dangerous, and I'd have to go alone." The women exchanged worried glances. They all knew what he wasn't, saying that leaving them alone meant leaving them vulnerable. "How long would you be gone?" Sarah asked quietly. 3 days, maybe 4, Matthew replied. "If the weather holds." They gathered in a circle, holding hands as Sarah led them in prayer. "Lord," she began, her voice strong and clear, "guide our brother Matthew as he provides for this family you have brought together. Keep him safe in your hands, and protect us all until he returns." "Amen," they all whispered, and Matthew felt their faith wrap around him like a warm blanket against the cold fear in his heart. Matthew rose before dawn, his breath misting in the cold cabin air. The women were already awake, pressed close to the cooking fire as they prepared a small breakfast of cornmeal mush. No one spoke much. The weight of his departure hung heavy in the room. Sarah handed him a bundle wrapped in cloth. "Food for your journey," she said softly. "We'll keep watch until you return." The sky was still dark as Matthew strapped on his snowshoes and slung his rifle across his back. The snow had drifted deep overnight, pristine and untouched in the pale pre-dawn light. He adjusted the pack on his shoulders, checked his powder horn one last time, and set out toward the high country where the elk would be wintering. It was brutal. Even with snowshoes, Matthew sank to his thighs in places where the wind had sculpted deep drifts. The bitter cold cut through his wool coat like knives, and his beard grew stiff with ice from his labored breathing. Still, he pressed on, breaking trail through the endless white Lord. "Keep them safe," he whispered as he trudged forward, his prayer visible in frozen puffs. "Guard their hearts and that cabin until I return." By nightfall, his legs trembled. With exhaustion, Matthew found shelter beneath a massive pine, its branches sweeping low to create a natural lean-to. He scraped away the snow, laid down his bedroll, and built a small fire. The flames cast dancing shadows as he huddled close, eating a little of the bread Sarah had packed. The night was achingly silent, except for the occasional crack of branches. Under their burden of snow, back at the cabin, the women maintained their vigil. They took turns keeping the fire built high, its warmth a barrier against both cold and fear. Others checked and reset the rabbit snares Matthew had taught them to. Used though the traps remained empty, the second day dawned clear and sharp. Matthew was moving again before first light, following game trails through the deep forest. Near midday, he finally spotted what he'd been searching for, a small herd of elk pawing through the snow for winter grass. His heart leaped at the sight of their strong bodies moving through the trees. Matthew took his time, working closer through the deep snow. The wind was in his favor, carrying his scent away from the animals. When he finally raised his rifle, his hands were steady despite the cold. The shot cracked across the valley like thunder. One elk dropped clean, while the others bounded away. Into the forest. "Thank you, Lord," Matthew breathed, making his way to where the elk lay. It was a young cow, her meat tender. He worked quickly to dress the carcass before the meat could freeze, his knife sure despite his cold-numbed fingers. As Matthew prepared to drag the quartered meat back toward home, a shadow detached itself from the trees. His hand flew to his rifle, but the figure raised empty palms in greeting. It was a Ute scout, tall and watchful, wrapped in a wool blanket against the cold. "I am Henry Black Elk," the man said simply. "I have followed your trail these 2 days." Matthew nodded cautiously. "I'm Matthew Yoder." "I know who you are," Henry replied. "I know of the women you shelter and the men who hunt them." His dark eyes were serious. "The speculator has hired guns-bad men who care nothing for law. They plan to burn your cabin, force the women back east." Matthew's heart clenched at the news, but Henry wasn't finished. "I have watched you, seen how you treat these women with respect. If you need witness before the judge, I will speak of your honest heart." "Why would you help us?" Matthew asked quietly. Henry's face was grave. "Because I have seen too many promises broken, too many driven from their homes. Truth must be defended, or all are lost." Matthew bowed his head, humbled by this unexpected alliance. "Thank you," he said simply. "I am in your debt." The journey home was arduous, but strengthened by purpose. Matthew's legs burned as he dragged the heavy meat across the snow, but thoughts of the women kept him moving forward as darkness fell. He finally spotted lamplight glowing from his cabin windows. The door flew open at his approach, spilling golden light across the snow. The women's voices rose in welcome, a spontaneous hymn of thanksgiving that brought tears to Matthew's ice-crusted lashes. Strong hands helped him inside, took his coat, sat him by the fire. Soon the cabin was filled with the rich smell of elk stew cooking. The women moved around him with quiet efficiency, hanging his wet clothes to dry, brewing hot coffee, sharing the day's small news. Their voices wrapped around him like a warm blanket, and Matthew felt the last of the cold finally leave his bones. Morning. Sunlight streamed through the cabin windows as the women worked to preserve the elk meat Matthew had brought home. Smoke rose from the outdoor fire pit, where they carefully tended strips of meat, the rich aroma filling the crisp winter air. Inside, others packed salted portions into crocks, their movements sure and practiced. Though the bounty lifted their Spirits. Henry's warning about hired guns cast a long shadow. Matthew watched the women work, his jaw tight with worry. He knew they needed help beyond what his rifle could provide. "Legal help, Sarah," he called softly to the tall woman directing the meat preservation. "Would you ride into town with me? Judge Harlan might be our best hope now." Sarah nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "Let me change into something proper." Within minutes, she emerged in a clean black dress, her prayer cap tied neatly under her chin. The ride into town was quiet, both lost in thought as their horses picked their way through the snowy trail. The town seemed unusually still when they arrived, though Matthew noticed curtains twitching as they passed. They tied their horses outside the judge's office, a modest wooden building with a tin star nailed above the door. Judge Harlan looked up from his desk as they entered, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Matthew Yoder, I've been expecting. You might come." He gestured to the chairs before his desk. "Please, sit." Matthew removed his hat, waiting for Sarah to settle before taking his own seat. "Judge, we need your help. There's men threatening to burn us out, claiming they have papers." "Yes," Harlan interrupted, pulling out a folder. "The speculator filed documents claiming legal guardianship over these women. Claims their bishop back east granted him authority." He spread the papers across his desk, showing official-looking seals and signatures. Sarah's face paled, but her voice remained steady. "That bishop had no right. Our father's farm was ours by law." The judge leaned back, studying them both. "The documents look suspicious to my eye. Too neat, too convenient. But I need proof of fraud to act." He tapped the papers meaningfully. "Bring me evidence, and I'll make this right." Outside the streets had filled with morning traffic, townsfolk stopped to stare as Matthew and Sarah emerged from the judge's office. A group of men lounged against the mercantile's porch, their faces dark with disapproval. "Fool mountain man," one spat as they passed, throwing everything away for foreign women. "Ain't natural. Them being so tall," another muttered. "Ought to know their place." Sarah walked past them, her head high and back straight. Her quiet dignity seemed to shame them, and their voices dropped to guilty mumbles. Matthew marveled at her strength, feeling his own spine straighten in response. The sun was setting when they returned to the cabin, casting long shadows across the snow. The other women gathered around as Matthew and Sarah shared the judge's words. Hope and fear mingled on their faces as they absorbed the news. "We need proof," Sarah explained, her voice firm. "Something to show the bishop had no right to our land." "The letters?" Ruth, one of the younger women, suddenly exclaimed. "Father's letters about the deed, they're in my trunk." The women hurried to the corner where their belongings were stored. They lifted out a worn leather trunk, its brass fittings dull with age. Ruth's hands trembled as she opened it carefully, lifting out bundles of papers tied with faded ribbon. "Here," she said, passing yellowed sheets to Sarah, "Father wrote these the month before he died. He was so worried about protecting our inheritance." Sarah read through the letters slowly, her eyes brightening. "These show everything. The original land purchase, Father's will leaving it to us. Even the bishop's earlier letters acknowledging our rightful ownership." She looked up at Matthew, joy breaking across her face. "This is the proof we need." Matthew felt his heart lift. Finally, they had something concrete to fight back with. The women gathered closer, their voices rising in excitement as they discussed taking the letters to Judge Harlan. But their celebration was cut short by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Matthew moved to the window, peering out into the gathering darkness. He could just make out the shapes of riders circling their cabin, keeping to the shadows of the trees. The threat wasn't just papers anymore. It was flesh and blood. Watching and waiting, the women fell silent, hearing it too. Sarah carefully gathered the precious letters, securing them in a safe place. They all knew the night would be long, filled with watching and prayer. But now they had hope proof that justice was on their side, if they could just hold out long enough to show it. Dawn broke cold and clear over the mountain cabin. Inside, Matthew checked his rifle, while Sarah carefully wrapped their precious letters in oilcloth. The other women gathered in a circle, their tall frames casting long shadows in the early morning light. "Lord, watch over them," Ruth prayed, her voice steady. "Guide their path and protect your truth." The women's voices joined together in a hymn. As Matthew and Sarah mounted their horses, the sound followed them down the trail. As they descended toward town, fresh snow blanketed the ground, making the horses' hooves whisper through the drifts. Matthew kept scanning the trees, something prickling at the back of his neck. The forest seemed to quiet. No birdsong, no squirrel chatter, just the creak of saddle leather and their horses breathing. "Sarah," he said softly, "we're being watched." She nodded, her face calm, though her hands tightened on the reins. They rounded a bend in the trail, and suddenly 2 riders burst from the trees ahead, blocking their path. Their horses stamped nervously as the men leveled pistols hand over. "Them papers," the larger man growled. "Nobody needs to get hurt." Matthew's rifle was in his hands before he could think. He aimed high and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the winter air, sending snow tumbling from pine branches. "That was a warning," Matthew called out, his voice stronger than he felt. "Next one won't be." The smaller rider laughed, spurring his horse forward. But Sarah was faster. She snatched up a rock from beside her saddle and hurled it with stunning force. The stone struck the man's shoulder, making him yelp and reel in his saddle. "Go!" Matthew shouted, wheeling his horse around. Sarah was already moving, her horse plunging through the deep snow beside the trail. Matthew followed, ducking low over his horse's neck as they crashed through the underbrush. Behind them, angry shouts and pistol shots rang out, but the trees provided cover as they fled. Their horses were lathered and blowing hard. When they finally galloped into town, people scattered from their path as they thundered down the main street, not slowing until they reached the judge's office. They dismounted quickly, Sarah clutching the oilcloth packet to her chest as they hurried inside. Judge Harlan looked up in alarm at their breathless entrance. "Good Lord, what's happened?" "Ambush on the trail," Matthew panted, still gripping his rifle. "They tried to take these." Sarah unwrapped the letters with trembling fingers and laid them on the judge's desk. Harlan adjusted his spectacles and began to read, his expression growing darker with each page. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock and the occasional rustle of paper. Finally, he looked up, his face grave. "These prove it," he said quietly. "The bishop had no authority to sign over your land. The speculator's documents are a clear fraud." He straightened the papers carefully. "I'll convene a hearing first thing tomorrow. This ends now." Relief flooded through Matthew, making his knees weak. Sarah's eyes shone with tears as she gripped his arm. With darkness falling early and snow beginning to fall, they took a longer route, watching constantly for pursuit, but reached the cabin without incident. The women rushed out to meet them, helping them dismount their exhausted horses. "The judge believes us," Sarah announced as they stepped inside the warm cabin. "He's calling a hearing tomorrow." Jubilant voices filled the room as the women embraced each other. Ruth was already ladling out bowls of hot stew, and the rich aroma made his stomach growl. They had just sat down to eat when Mary, the youngest, froze with her spoon halfway to her mouth. "Look," she whispered, pointing to the window. Matthew's heart stopped. Through the glass, he could see flickering lights appearing in the tree line. One by one, torches bloomed in the darkness, forming a ring around the cabin. The men had come at last. He grabbed his rifle, checking the loads with practiced hands. "Get to the back room," he ordered, but the women didn't move. "No," Sarah said firmly, standing tall beside him. "We'll not run anymore. This is our home." The other women rose as well, their faces set with determination. Some began to sing softly, their voices steady despite the fear. Matthew felt strength flow through him as he watched the torches draw closer. Knowing he was no longer alone, the cabin glowed with lamplight as they faced the darkness together. Waiting to see what would come, Matthew's hands moved quickly, sliding heavy furniture against the cabin walls. The women worked alongside him, their tall frames lifting benches and tables with practiced strength. Outside, horses snorted in the darkness, while angry voices drew closer. "They mean to burn us out," Matthew said grimly, checking his rifle's ammunition. He had only 15 rounds left. "Get ready with the water buckets." The first rocks struck the cabin like thunder, smashing against logs and rattling the remaining windows. Sarah shepherded the younger women away from the walls, while Ruth extinguished most of the lamps to make harder targets. In the dim light, their shadows danced large against the walls. A bullet splintered through a shutter. embedding itself in the far wall. Matthew returned fire carefully, aiming high to warn rather than wound. The women's voices rose in song, steady and strong despite the chaos. A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing. The hymn filled the cabin, somehow making the gunshots seem smaller. Matthew felt his racing heart slow as he listened, drawing courage from their faith. More rocks pelted the roof, while threats echoed through the night. "Come out now, or we'll burn you all. You can't hide forever." But the women kept singing, their voices neither wavering nor afraid. Hours crept by like this violence outside, song within. Finally, as false dawn began to pale the sky, the attackers' voices grew distant. "We'll be back with more men." Someone shouted, and fire enough to light up this whole mountain. Hoofbeats faded into the forest. Matthew slumped against the wall, his hands shaking as he set down his rifle. "I almost lost heart there," he confessed quietly. "Thought we were done for." Sarah crossed to him, touching his shoulder gently. "Remember what Paul wrote when? We are weak, then we are strong. God's power shows brightest in our darkest hours." The other women nodded, gathering close. Together they knelt in prayer as morning light crept through the bullet holes in the walls. Later that morning, Matthew helped the women relocate to the hidden dugout. They carried supplies and bedding through the snow, careful to obscure their tracks. Henry appeared silently from the trees as they worked, his face grave. "The hearing starts at noon," he said. "We should ride soon." Matthew clasped Sarah's hands before mounting up. "Stay safe," he said. "I'll return with news as quick as I can." The ride to town was tense, but uneventful. They found the courthouse already crowded, townsfolk packed shoulder to shoulder to witness the proceedings. Judge Harlan sat stern-faced at his bench while the speculator lounged nearby, looking smug. "This court will hear evidence regarding land claims and allegations of fraud," Harlan announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Mr. Yoder, present your case. Present your case." Matthew stepped forward, unfolding the letters with trembling fingers. He read them aloud: the father's will, property deeds, correspondence proving the bishop had no right to seize the land. The crowd shifted uncomfortably as the truth became clear. Then Henry rose to speak. "I have watched these people," he said, his quiet voice commanding attention. "The women work hard, pray often, harm no one. This man," he gestured to Matthew, "speaks truth and defends the innocent. But those who chase them bring only violence and lies." The speculator jumped up, face red. "These are just wandering women. They have no right silence." Judge Harlan's gavel cracked like a gunshot. He studied the letters again, then looked up, eyes hard as flint. "The evidence is clear. The bishop's claim was fraudulent, and you, sir, conspired in that fraud. This court finds in favor of Mr. Yoder and his companions." A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. The speculator spluttered, but Harlan wasn't finished. "Furthermore, you'll face charges for attempted arson and assault. Bailiff, take him into custody." Matthew stood stunned as the crowd's mood shifted. Neighbors who had shunned him now stepped forward to shake his hand. The minister offered prayers of blessing. Even the sheriff nodded respectfully. "Justice done," Henry said simply, clasping Matthew's shoulder before slipping away. Matthew mounted up quickly, eager to share the news. The winter sun was bright on the snow as he rode home, hope rising in his chest with each hoofbeat. The long shadows were finally lifting, and light was breaking through at last. Word spread through the valley like wildfire. Matthew and Henry rode back to the cabin through softening afternoon snow, their horses' hooves breaking fresh trails. As they approached, the women emerged from the dugout, faces anxious with hope. "The judge ruled in our favor," Matthew called out, his voice strong and clear. "The speculator is in custody. You are free." Sarah reached him first as he dismounted, wrapping him in a fierce embrace. The other women crowded around, tears streaming down their faces as they hugged both Matthew and Henry, their joyful sobs mixed with prayers of thanksgiving. "God has delivered us," Sarah whispered, wiping her eyes. "Through you, Matthew." The next few days passed in a flurry of activity. Together they assessed the cabin's damaged broken windows, scorched walls, bullet-riddled shutters. Matthew showed them how to replace damaged logs, while the women mixed fresh mud and straw for chinking. Their shared labor made the work lighter. To everyone's surprise, wagons began arriving from town. First came the minister with a load of glass panes and putty. Then the mercantile owner brought nails and shingles. Even families who had turned their backs now appeared bearing sacks of flour, dried apples, and offers of help. "We were wrong to doubt," the blacksmith admitted. Head bowed. "Please forgive us." Matthew met each gesture with quiet grace. "The Lord provides," he would say, directing their offerings to where they were needed most. "We give him the glory." When Sunday arrived, the little church was packed full. The minister invited the women to lead the morning hymns. They stood tall, their voices rising pure and powerful in amazing grace. Matthew joined them, no longer shrinking from attention. His deep bass blended with their soaring harmony as sunshine streamed through colored windows. That evening, they gathered around their restored table. The cabin glowed with lamplight, warm and whole again. Fresh bread steamed beside bowls of rich elk stew. Before they ate, Matthew bowed his head. "Lord," he prayed, his voice steady and sure, "we thank you for your mercy through these trials, for providing food and shelter, for bringing justice to light." He paused, emotion thick in his throat. "Most of all, we thank you for just of blood, but of faith. You have given this lonely man a home at last. Amen. Amen." The women echoed softly, their faces shining with joy. Outside, stars began appearing in the dark mountain sky. Inside the cabin, lamplight gleamed on the fresh-swept floors and newly chinked walls. But the real brightness came from the faces gathered around the Tabula family, bound together by something stronger than persecution or fear. They had found belonging in each other and in God's faithful care. Spring swept into the Colorado mountains like a gentle awakening. Patches of snow melted away, revealing tender green shoots and bright wildflowers dotting the slopes. Matthew stood on his porch one dawn, marveling at how different everything felt from just months ago. "Time to build, brother," Sarah called. Emerging from the cabin with rolled-up plans they had sketched together, over the next weeks the small cabin grew into something grander. Matthew and the women worked side by side, their strength matched to the task. New rooms sprouted from the original structure like branches from a strong trunk. They raised thick log walls and laid sturdy floor planks, creating space enough for all to live comfortably. The barn rose next, its framework reaching toward blue mountain skies. Gardens took shape, rich soil turned by 10 pairs of capable hands. Fence posts marched across the land, marking their growing homestead. Word spread through the valley about the remarkable lodge. Children began appearing, drawn by curiosity about the tall women who spoke so kindly and sang so beautifully. Soon, the cabin buzzed with young voices, learning hymns and quilting stitches. Travelers found welcome there too, warming themselves by the ever-burning hearth where fresh bread filled the air with its homey scent. At night, hymns floated across the valley, a beacon of peace in the wilderness. One evening, as lamplight cast its warm glow over the supper table, Matthew looked at the faces of his family. His voice grew soft with emotion as he lifted his cup. "I was alone once, but God sent me 10 angels." The women's smiles brightened the room as they raised their voices in song. The familiar hymn, rising sweet and strong as the firelight, danced on the walls of their shared home. If you believe stories can heal, lift, and connect us, this channel is for you. Thanks for being here. Hit subscribe, and I'll meet you again tomorrow with something real.